Sometimes I feel like King can be a little bit uneven in his storytelling, but somehow he still makes it work. Hey, what's up, bookworms and constant readers? Mike back today to take you into the multiverse, as today we'll be dealing with 1995's Rose Matter. This is the 23rd novel published under his own name. If you haven't been following along with Into the Multiverse, I'll be doing the Richard Bachman stuff later. We're focusing on just the novels by Mr. King as Mr. King this go around. If you're one of those dozen of people, dozens maybe, people who like those reading excerpts I do, I didn't do one for this one, guys, because honestly, there's just not any artwork out there except for that photo that is briefly mentioned, not briefly, but quite prevalent in this book. So I just decided I wasn't going to do one for this one. So if you're one of those who do like those, I do apologize. We'll get back to them on the next one, which is going to be Green Mile. But as for this book, guys, it seems to be like the forgotten child of the 90s for King. This was when he was undergoing a new transition in his writing style. I like to refer to it as the second arc of his career. And this one just seems like it kind of got sandwiched between two very unforgettable books. Now, Insomnia, I think because it got quite a tepid reaction, was probably the worst received Stephen King book for a long time when it was released. So this coming right after it, and then it was followed up by Green Mile, which was just like acclaimed by readers and critics alike. I think it's just kind of gotten forgotten over time. But I was one of those that I actually did read on release day when it came out. So we are in a real time now where I'm really reading these on release day, and I remember very, very little about it until I did this reread. So I'm going to kind of talk about that now. But guys, before we get into it, we got to talk about what is the book about. Now, aroused by a single drop of blood, Rose Daniels wakes up to a chilling realization that her husband is going to kill her. And she takes flight, but with his credit card. Alone in a strange city, Rosie begins to build a new life. She meets Bill Steiner and she finds an old junk shop painting, Rose Matter, which strangely seems to want her as much as she wants it. But it's hard for Rosie not to keep looking over her shoulder. Rose Madden and on the rampage, Norman is a corrupt cop with a dog's instinct for tracking people, and he's getting closer. Rosie can feel just how close he is getting. Guys, it takes us back to 1995. This is Rose Matter. Now, when we get into the good and the bad with this book, I do want to start with the good, because it is kind of a mixed bag. I'm not going to lie to you here. But the good is I feel like it's great that King is embracing the weird again. You can tell he was really knee-deep in writing the end of Dark Tower at this point, because he really feels like the last couple books he's really went back to the weird. Like, you think back to like Gerald's Game and Dolores Claiborne. Those are good stories, but they never really felt really the King weirdness, I think, that we're used to. Those are a little more grounded. This he really does embrace going back to the weird, the supernatural, the unexplained phenomenon, that kind of thing. He really does in this, and it's kind of hidden. It's hidden because this does feel like two stories in one. This does feel like the first half does feel like a domestic abuse, kind of trying to liberate yourself from that kind of story. And then the second half feels like, I don't know, maybe he was watching History Channel one night and he saw this special on some Greek mythology and said, you know what, I got to find a way to write the Minotaur's Labyrinth into my story. So it's quite weird, and it isn't the way that I think most people would be expecting from King. He does do some things that any other author try to do this in this type of story. It wouldn't work, but somehow he's able to pull it off. But it does feel like two stories in one, which I think is actually good. But I can see why, in my memory, reading this as a teenager, I don't really recall a lot about it. I remembered that it was about someone fleeing an abusive husband, but outside of that, I didn't remember a ton about it. But on this reread, I think I really do like that second half a lot. And I don't know if I didn't like that when I was a teenager. I don't know. It seems weird, because that seems like, as teenager me, that would have been something I've been more into than the stuff I had no real life experience with, and when it just adult relationships was something I hadn't done at 15 years old. But I think just describing that fear of just, your everyday life being around someone that you think just might kill you one day on a whim. They might just wake up in a bad mood. Your face might be pissing them off, and they might just decide to just stab you and kill you. A lot of people, guys especially, probably wouldn't talk about this, but I was living in a very, very abusive relationship physically as well as mentally, before I met my wife, with someone who hit me, someone who screamed at me, someone who clawed me, someone who came at me with a knife one time. So a lot of this stuff did hit kind of close to home for me. I know a lot of people don't like to talk about those things. For me, that's, getting that out in the open, that those things do happen, is obviously something that's going to help. Maybe someone's going through the same thing. And I think this is the kind of book that creates those kind of conversations. And I think that's something that's very, very much good about it, is it can get those kind of things out there. Because I hear things all the time, oh, if your spouse is so terrible, why don't you just leave? And I think this book captures why it's not so easy. Sometimes you're scared of, what if they don't let you go? When you're dealing with someone that isn't quite right in the head, that's always a possibility. But I think something that's very, very prevalent in this book is a theme that King touches on quite frequently, and that is, even in books with supernatural, big, scary, hairy monsters, it's about the pain and hurt that humans will do to other humans. And that is very, very much the thing in this book, because Norman, he is one for the record books. That dude is crazy. Now, as for Rosie, I won't say she's one of my favorite protagonists in the King universe. I talked about some of my favorite protagonists in the King universe recently, and she wasn't on there. I don't think she was ever really in, even in contention to be in there. But however, you will find yourself in her corner. You will be rooting for her. She is a very good character because, again, who writes characters better than Mr. King? No one. No one. And this is no exception. She's a great, great character that you're definitely wanting to see win. Obviously, if you just have any human decency, you want to see her get out of the situation she's in. But as far as her journey, you're very, very much invested along the way. So I just love that you can just tell how much he was into Dark Tower while reading this, because he really did embrace some of that weirdness that you would find in the Dark Tower, and he continues to try to find ways to match it into his everyday multiverse book. So this is the part where he was just full speed ahead on Dark Tower, and he's got no problems ramping that stuff up into his stories. And we'll talk about that more in Multiverse Connections at the end. But is everything good? Of course not. Like I said, a very, very mixed book. As for the bad, now this isn't necessarily anything I found actually bad, but I think it's just some stuff that, might not work for you. I will say that Norman is a cartoonishly evil villain. I mean, like, to the point to where it's just like, I have, a mustache and I'm just twirling it. It will kind of feel like that sometimes. However, the unfortunate part is there are very much people like Norman in the world. There really are sickos like that. There are crooked cops like him. There are, woman beaters like him. There are just awful, awful people that do awful, awful things. I won't get into all the details of everything he does, but it's like, really, anytime you think this guy can't actually be any worse, he's done something worse than you've even seen on the page yet. So I think that might not rub some people the right way. I think you will kind of just be like, this is just almost just laughably evil character. But, somehow, again, King does make that kind of character work. But I can see some people being like, I just can't take this seriously. Look, major trigger warning, guys. This book has domestic abuse, sexual abuse, violence, miscarriages. All those things are in this, and it really, I think if you read the prologue of this book, which is probably the most uncomfortable Stephen King prologue ever, I think you'll know right then if this is a book for you or not. If those things bother you, obviously, no judgment from me. I get that. For me, I think the reason that we read King is because he makes us uncomfortable. He gives us the warts and all. He doesn't turn the camera away. He doesn't fade to black. But I can understand, especially if you've been someone who has gone through some of these things, this might be a little too much for you. So I can understand that. I can definitely understand that. So a warning that it is very, very R-rated in that respect. He will explain to you. He will tell you how the sausage is made. And sometimes it ain't pretty. It's definitely nothing that you want to eat afterwards. Some may not like just how down the rabbit hole the second half of this book goes, because it does feel like two books kind of mashed together. I think it works, but I think some people will have a problem of having that kind of like jump the shark moment. They might feel like it does do that, because this book feels a lot more Dark Tower than it does, Dolores Claiborne, because I feel like you could see it almost feels like if you had took Dolores Claiborne and mashed it into the Dark Tower, that's almost kind of what it would feel like to most people. So I can see how that isn't going to work for everyone. I think constant readers will be okay with it, but, casuals may be like, this is just too strange for me. So yeah, one half domestic abuse story, one half Greek mythology History Channel special. That's definitely how I feel about it. But it does mesh well, but it's not going to work for everyone. But what about you? Why should you read this book? I feel like if you like what he began with Gerald's Game and Dolores Claiborne, you'll really, really like the first half of this book. You'll really get into it. And then if you're just along for the ride, I think you'll like where King takes you. But if you're wanting it all just to be like a Dolores Claiborne, I don't think you're going to get that. I think you're going to kind of be a little disappointed with where it goes. But again, if you are into the fantastical side of Stephen King, I think you'll like what he does, because this is probably the weirdest he's been since the 80s. I really do think this was him really going back to his roots a little bit and getting a little weird. And I can't find a better word for it than some weird tales, because it is awfully strange. And it's one of those, like, I have no idea how he came up with that. Unless it's like I said, he was watching History Channel and said, how do I get this into my book? Back to the domestic abuse thing, I think if you are a victim of domestic abuse, I think this book can be liberating, actually. It's tough to read, like I said, but I actually think it is liberating. Now, King has gone on the record that while he thinks that this isn't one of his better stories, he says something he will always be proud of is how many people come up to him to book signings and things like that and tell him that this book gave them the courage to leave their abusive spouse. So I think in that regard, I feel like it can be liberating. And I know that people think that domestic abuse is, one-sided. It's not, guys. Like I said, I've been through it. A lot of people have been through it. It isn't really just a gender thing. It really is. But I do feel like both sides of that story have something that they will take into here. And I think that they will actually find it quite liberating. So in my experience, that is how it goes. Other people, it's going to be different for everybody. Your mileage is definitely going to vary there. But I do think it's something that can feel a little liberating if that is something that you're looking for. And it's definitely one that I think you should give a shot for that reason, if anything alone. Hopefully you haven't ever had to go through anything like that, and you'll just be able to enjoy this as a story. But I'm saying that you're going to get a visceral reaction one way or the other if you have been through that. But as for some final thoughts, guys, on this reread, I'm liking his 90s stuff a lot more than I did in my memory. And I think that's because when I was a teenager, I still just wanted Stephen King to scare me. I mean, when he had moved into this phase of his career, I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. Where's my big scary monsters, my icons and stuff like that. But as an adult with some real life experience now, I can enjoy stories like these more. And this one is no different. Like I said, I didn't have it nearly as bad as Rose has it in this book or anything like that. But it did bring back some rather dark memories that I've kind of, buried way back there in the old thought cage. So, it's something that I think these stories have more impact as an older reader just as much as the 80s stuff would as a younger reader. So again, that's why I always say I feel like the guy's a dark wizard, because you get something different reading his books as a teenager as you do as an adult, with children and things like that. So this one's no different here. So I think that this book can be a little unfocused at times. It really, really can. Sometimes I feel like he wants one foot in the ground and one foot in the weird. It's something that I complained about with the Bill Hodges trilogy. But with this one, I think I mostly can go with it. But it does kind of almost feel a little unfocused. It does sometimes feel like he had two different stories and he said, F it, I'm just going to go ahead and mash it into one story. So I think it just, if you get down with some of the allegory that he's playing with in the third act with this, it's really going to click for you. But I think for most others, I think that's why this book is never really talked about. And I think it's one of the reasons that King doesn't particularly like it himself. But look, it's definitely not what I would call a great Stephen King book, but it's still really good, and I think it is right there on underrated, in the underrated category. But what I've said before, guys, is I feel like even a just okay Stephen King book is usually better than most other authors' best books. So I'm going to kind of put it there. So lots of warts in this one, warts that he will show you, but I do still think it is worth a read. How about some Multiverse Connections, guys? And I got to give you a quick spoiler warning here. I might talk about some things in other stories. I don't go really deep into detail, but if you want no hints of Easter eggs or stuff that connections to other stories, I have to kind of give you that spoiler warning there. So let's go ahead and kick it off here with Misery. That's the big one, I think. Well, not the big one, but it's one of the big ones here. And that Paul Sheldon from Misery, the author, his books are mentioned quite frequently in this. Anna has some in her desk at the women's shelter. And of course, Rosie is actually reading a Paul Sheldon Misery book when Norman first flies off the handle and attacks her in the early parts of this book. So I think we've seen a lot of that. I think the Library Policeman, things like that. We've seen some Paul Sheldon books all over the place within the multiverse. It's always a fun callback to see what old Misery is up to these days. The drawing of the three, that's Dark Tower number 2. Obviously, the photo, this painting, this Rose Matter painting, is very, very similar to what happened with the drawing of Eddie and Odetta in the drawing of the three. I think it's not much of a doorway, but it seems like it is a doorway to another world, obviously. And in my mind, it's got to be the doorway to Roland's world. It says there's so much other Dark Tower stuff in this. Got to talk about some of those miscellaneous Dark Tower connections. There's mentions of Ka. I think they say Ka is a wheel that controls the world one time. There's some high speech. They say things like well met. There's mentions of the city of Lud, which is where you see Blaine the Mono. There is mentions of Midworld and numerous other things that I can't think of at the moment. But it was just very much, yes, Dark Tower is very much in his mind while he was writing this. And I think that's a great thing. That's always a fun connection to see as Dark Tower stuff. Insomnia is another one you got to talk about because, Susan Day, how many kids did you kill today? The activist in that story does have a framed photo in Anna's office in this book. So that's obviously just being the book right after. Maybe that was still in his head. Maybe he was writing these concurrently or whatever. But fun little connections so recently are nice and make it feel like almost like you're living in the same town, and that's what it kind of feels like. And I've always appreciated that about the multiverse. It's never anything when you've got to read something else to feel like, oh, this is a connection, as much as it is like nice nods to former things. It makes it feel like it is still the same living, breathing world, and that's what I appreciate about the multiverse. And of course, Desperation, Cynthia Smith. Cynthia Smith is a very prevalent character in Desperation, which I'll be reading next because I've already read The Green Mile. I think that having her in this story at the the Daughters and the Sisters Women's Shelter was something I did not remember. So that's a fun connection there because I do remember Cynthia in Desperation, but I did not remember that she shows up in this. I would say that some of the other ladies at that shelter do show up, or they're at least mentioned in Desperation as well, because I can't think of anywhere else I've heard of a woman named Gert before, so I really think that's something that either shows up in Desperation or Regulators. I do know these three books are kind of connected-ish, and that's why I love talking about the Multiverse Connections for the Into the Multiverse series, guys. So that was Rose Matter. I think like I said, an underrated book, but nothing I'm going to tell you to bust your TBR for. But I will say if you're doing like a straight reread or read through of his bibliography, I definitely wouldn't skip it. I definitely think it's worth your time. So, guys, that's what I think. Did you read Rose Matter? What did you think? Drop in the comments and let me know, and I will talk to you there.